those who control the company, for example, they may pursue they put their own goals ahead of the corporate goals.
They're violating fiduciary duty. Yeah.
So I mean, so to what extent, for example, this issue is applicable to family-owned business, and how can it be controlled or minimized?
It depends. If you are partly a publicly owned company, okay, then all sorts of laws apply. So one way or the other, you have to have good auditing standards, good board governance standards. You have to have all of those kind of things that are there, so that things are done in a very clear and transparent manner. If it's purely a family-owned business, right, it depends upon how clear and transparent you want to be. There's not a mandate to do it, but it probably is in your best interest to do so. But is what you probably know more than I do, when you bring openness and transparency to companies that have not had it before, sometimes you discover not such good things.
But you have to incur some cost in order to control that problem.
Yes. You may be encountering things when you bring in transparency and objectivity, and you may realize that some family members have maybe doing something that are not so good that you did not realize about. So there's a real issue there. The agency issue is still there. It brings on a very much more of a legal sense when you're a publicly traded company. But the conflict of interest is what you're really saying is still there. Right? I mean, you do have an odd, just to give an odd example, is the Ford Motor Company, is that it is a publicly traded company, but it's still controlled by the Ford family, because they have a second class of shares that basically overrides all the publicly traded shares. So you can kind of play games, if you will, like that, but I would be very cautious about doing that kind of thing. So the other kind of thing what's going to be happening is there's going to be a change in family politics. Uh-oh. Anytime you bring a stranger into the family, what happens? Anytime you bring in somebody new, what happens? When you start changing who has what kind of power, what happens? And so one of the things, and I know that you can't completely anticipate all of this, but one of the things what is really important to do is to look and do, for lack of a better word, a risk analysis of key family members to say, you know, if we bring in a CEO, bring in a stranger, okay, how are they going to be affected? Are they not going to care because they want to maximize money? Right? They're like, who cares, right? As long as we make more money, that's all I care about. Or is it going to be, wow, I really wanted to have the status of being a CEO of this company, and now I'm not going to get it. And I don't like it. And I'm going to see if I can sabotage the CEO so that then I can become the CEO instead. That kind of thing has happened. You know that. The other kind of question, and I talked about this before, is the continuity versus change. Is that if you bring in a CEO simply just to be a good operations manager, which is perfectly okay, you're assuming the future is going to be like the past. If, on the other hand, what you're doing is you're realizing that you really, or that the company needs to be making some kind of major change in its business model because we think something else is going to be happening as a result. And in this region of the world, lots of things can happen that can change, as all of you very well know more than I do. Then in that particular case, do you want to be bringing in someone who can actually change the direction of the company? Maybe go into completely different lines of business. Maybe close businesses that are not profitable anymore. Oh boy, even though it was your cousin that's running the business. So how are you going to be dealing with this circumstance? There are no right answers. Okay? I mean, someone once said, Peter Drucker actually once said, is that you don't bring in a consultant to give you answers. You bring in a consultant to ask the right questions. Okay? The answers are going to have to be coming from you. One of the other potential differences in here is the differences between the upbringing all right, of the founder and business owner and the CEO coming in. Probably, not always, but probably is that the CEOs are probably going to be having more education, but they are less experienced in your exact niche. So they're going to be having a broader experience, but maybe not so deep in terms of what the actual business is itself. And so because of that, there probably are going to be some communication issues. Because you're assuming, well, this is on how it works here, and I know how it works here because this is how now it's worked here for 20 years. And maybe coming in from another country, another industry, and guess what? They may have a very different perspective. And guess what? That's a good thing. A conflict is not necessarily, a fitna, if I know the term right, okay, is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's when you start using knives and guns, that's where the problem comes in, okay? when your weapons are words in discussion and there's open conflict and disagreement, if it's done in good faith, that's a good thing. And I know that's not hard to do any place. I know it's a little bit hard to do in the Mideast also, since I know the conflict is not openly brought out very easily at times.
If you are going to bring someone to run your business, of course, you are going to examine his CV. You want to make sure he has the expertise and the experience. And you are supposed to have full confidence in him.
Yes.
So maybe some problem might arise in the future, but not at the beginning. So before you bring someone to run the business, of course, you must have an idea, or you have full confidence that he has the necessary tools, the necessary skills, the experience, the expertise to run the business.
You do, but what can happen is that because there is not a common language, I don't mean Arabic versus English, I mean a common business language, that people can easily miscommunicate what's happening. So you think, oh, he did this and this and this thing, and maybe he didn't exactly do this and this thing. Okay? And so it's not just looking at his or her CV.
Maybe it is the problem of the business owner.
It may be the problem of the business owner, because as someone once said, you don't know what you don't know, right? And when you're in that circumstance, you may think, oh, good, he has all of this experience in this, that means I don't need to worry about it, I don't need to think about it. Maybe not, okay? This is where the transition really comes in place, because what can happen is that the board basically thinks, good, we've hired a CEO, haras, right? We don't need to think about it anymore. You go do your own thing. What that suggests is that the board and the CEO don't communicate very often, and that can be a real problem. So even if you bring someone who you believe is super confident, truly capable, all those good things, right? Everything sounds good. That doesn't mean that you still have to question things, you still have to ask things, but you still have to give him the authority to do so. The communication has to happen all the time. If it's just at the beginning, you hire him and say, let me go, don't talk to me anymore, I think in the long term that's a recipe for failure. The other kind of thing too is, we talked about this, is what do you do with differences in opinion, right? What do you do when the owner disagrees with the CEO? Well, ultimately, the family can fire the CEO, right? Okay, that's okay. But again, maybe they're firing him because they're not comfortable with what he's telling. The reality of it is the CEO actually has the right answer. So you need to be careful, think about that. Lastly, you have to talk about the changing politics inside the company. Because when you bring in a CEO, when you bring in a stranger, it's not just affecting the highest level family members, is it? All of a sudden it's going to be affecting every single employee in the company. How are you going to be managing that kind of cultural change in that circumstance? Because if you don't, let's say that you and the board, the CEO and the board get along great, wonderful, okay? What happens if he can't communicate and work very well with all the people underneath him? That's going to be a recipe for failure right there. So how are you going to be managing the politics and the consensus and the systems inside the company so it can be dealt with well? Lastly and leastly, is that what are you going to be, what is the transition plan? You know, are you going to be giving him systematic authority? Next year he does more, next year he gets more authority, next year he gets more authority? Is he going to have specific milestones that he has to meet, and then if he does, he gets more authority? If he doesn't start making his numbers, then what are you going to do? Again, no right answers, but that's the transition that you have to start talking about. Because if you don't, there are going to be a big set of miscommunications and some big sets of problems. Yes, sir.
Transition plan. If you are getting, like, you started to have the CEO, and for the first time they go to have a CEO. So they give him the authority, whatever it is, and then he runs away with it. I will do this, he will do that, I'll do that. And then the problem starts because there is no transition from the old way of doing the business with the new way of having this CEO run association. And because you don't have a transition, then how can you be able to tell them how it needs to be done? So if the family are having a problem, you're talking about some other, but how can you get the family to understand what he thinks that he understands for the family? I.e., he comes up, a new one, he is very good with the other CEO jobs that he has done before, and he comes to this family, and there is no transition saying, look, you know, we'll have authorities, we'll talk to the to the owners, let them understand what you are doing. Transition.
Yeah.
If there is no transition, you're dead, are you not?
It's a recipe for more problems. That is for certain. On the other hand, let's look at it from a CEO's perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, is that, and this is another example, another company whose name, a Saudi company whose name I can't mention, is that thank you, is that in this particular case they hired a CEO about 1.5 years or 2 years ago. And from the CEO's perspective, all the family has been doing is questioning what he has been doing, every single step. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to do this, right? And you know, when you're constantly being questioned, one of which is if the CEO has low self-esteem, he could be failure threatened by that, for one. Secondly, if he has high self-esteem, he's going to be really irritated about it. Right? And just in talking with the CEO, when he was telling me these things, I found out, just by him telling me these things, right, that's all, okay, that's all. I found out 4 hours later he was looking for another job. And so, you know, you have to give him, just like what letting me do, you have to give him enough rope to hang himself with, but not so much that you're going to be losing complete control. And that's where the transition plan comes in, right? It says, okay, fine, you can do these things, you have authority to be spending X number of dollars on this project, right? Fine. Let's see on how that works. It works great. Fine. Now, in essence, you can, instead of doing it for $1 million authority, now you can be doing it for $5 million worth of authority for new projects, right? Cool, good. That works well, good. $100 million, whatever unit of value. Do it again, great. If there's a transition plan, that's going to be helping you. But you don't want to make the transition plan so slow, right? That again, the CEO doesn't have anything to do for a long time. So that's a matter of negotiation, so to speak. Lastly and not leastly, what are you going to do with your time? You've been putting in 40 some odd years, okay, of your time, right? How many decades and decades worth of time have all of you put in? What are you going to do when you're not doing it anymore? Are you going to just play with your grandkids? Great, okay? I think that's absolutely wonderful. I'm sure your grandkids could benefit from it. But what else are you going to do? Because remember, this is what's been driving you for a long time. And all of a sudden, haras, no more. Okay, question, Becky.
Great, thank you, David, for this information. I want to ask you a question here. You just mentioned about the Saudi company, which is a person who's 70 years old, and his kids are 20, and they're not ready to be a CEO. I think this is a good example because there is a case study about Heinz. It's one of the big companies, ketchup.
Yes.
And they end with a failure. It's a big family. The reason because I think the first generation, they worked very well. The second, the third, the fourth, they lost interest in the business. And I think to have kind of CEO to carry on, yes, it's a kind of risk, but sometimes you need it.
What's the risk of not doing anything?
I think number one, the risk because education, loss of interest. Like what happened to Heinz, that's an example. There's many companies which they have the same family business. But I believe, as you said, it's very important to be a person with a family member to be as a CEO, because it's a person who comes as a stranger to be there for a while. After that, he will leave and he'll take all the stuff with him, behind him.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, if you look at CEO tenure has declined a lot, all right, in the last 15, 20 years or so.
Exactly.
In U.S. publicly traded companies. There are lots of reasons for that. I'm not going to go into those lots of reasons. But part of the reason why they have changed CEOs is because the business itself has changed. They bring in someone who has great financial acumen, right? I mean, he really knows on how to make the numbers go well. Mm-hmm. Great, because that's what they need. Thank you, because that's what they need, okay? But guess what? All of a sudden, that they are in this major crisis, that financial focused CEO is not going to be the right one to do it. Someone else has to be coming along. So they bring in a CEO on a temporary basis as a way to do a turnaround for the company. Then that particular CEO